Hello, fellow fiends. Welcome to another episode of Creepy Cases and Spooky Spaces. I am your host, Cassie Opea. If this is your first episode, head on back. There are plenty of seasons, not so many on the YouTube because this is the first season that we've had the videos going. However, check out those past episodes. There are episodes every Friday. So definitely check in, follow along on your podcast platform. It'll notify you of new episodes and follow along. Subscribe on YouTube so you get all the notifications when a new episode is uploaded. Also, don't forget that Patreon and Anchor subscribers get bonus episodes every other Tuesday, early access to the weekly Friday episodes, a 10% subscriber discount on all merchandise in the Wiccan Fae shop. Of course, now that doesn't only mean Creepy Cases and Spooky Spaces merchandise, that also means those Wiccan Fae candles. That link or that coupon code is good for everything in that shop. Also, you will get a bonus kind of a welcome and thank you swag box from, well, yours truly. Don't forget to head over to pizzaandpigtails.com. That is where the Creepy Cases Spooky Spaces blog is located. The Wiccan Fae shop with all that awesome merchandise. And if you're into kind of just a lifestyle, pizza, pigtails, witchy, just random blog, go ahead and check out the Pizza and Pigtails blog as well. Follow along on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and even Pinterest at creepycases.spookyspaces. Also, like, comment, share, spread the word, shout it from the rooftops by a billboard, get the podcast spread, because that helps me create new content and that helps you see the new content. See how that works? Also, with the if you have a creepy case or a spooky space that you would like to see featured on the podcast, go ahead and shoot me an email at creepycases.spookyspaces@gmail.com. Basically, everything is the same. I tried to keep it a little simple because I know how sometimes it is hard to find things when you are Googling them because different platforms have different name setups, but I tried to keep it pretty easy for everything. Now that we got all of those formalities, all of that information out of the way, let's get started on this week's episode. I'm actually really excited to tell you about this episode. It is a whopper, a doozy, a just one of the craziest cases that I have covered. And it's actually a mysterious death of a pretty well-known, I guess you could consider him a celebrity. And not a lot of people know the details that surround his death. And I actually was really surprised when I learned about it myself, because I had never actually looked into the death of this person. That's a little weird anyway, because unless you hear about somebody's death being like, "Ooh, that's mysterious," or "that was very questionable," I don't think people just randomly Google people's deaths. Yeah, this actually could be considered one of my favorite authors, so that might give it away as to who we're going to be talking about today. However, let's get started because I'm bursting at the seams. I'm sure you can tell I'm a little excited with the way that I'm talking. So it was a dark and stormy night on October 3rd, 1849. It was also an election day, and Joseph Walker, who was a compositor for the Baltimore Sun, decided that he was going to head down to Gunners Hall. Now, Gunners Hall was a local pub, but they also served as a pop-up location for the Fourth Ward polls. And so it was pretty busy that evening. And as Walker approached the establishment, he encountered a man lying in the gutter, semi-conscious and incoherent. And most passing by had figured that the man was just in a drunken stupor, had one too many. But Walker realized that he was in great distress and in need of immediate assistance. Now, he also realized that the man was wearing shabby secondhand clothing that didn't fit him. And when Walker got close enough, he also noticed something that was rather shocking and unexpected. The man who was lying in the gutter was none other than the poet Edgar Allan Poe. Now, Walker asked the delirious Poe if he had anyone in the area who could help him, and Poe gave the name Joseph E. Snodgrass, a magazine editor who had some medical training. Now, Walker sent a letter immediately to Snodgrass, and unfortunately, Poe died 4 days later on October 7th. And the cause is actually still unknown today. But there are several theories. And amongst alcohol, starvation, rabies, murder, um, this is the mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe. Before I dig into Poe's death, let's talk about his life. It was a rather unlucky and tragic one that the writer, although now he is highly regarded as one of the best authors of all time, he never really hit that level of fame within his living years. Now, born Edgar Poe, January 19th, 1809, in Boston, Massachusetts. Edgar, an American writer, poet, editor, literary critic, best known for his poetry and short stories. He was a master of mystery, of the macabre, and whose name alone can still evoke an eerie chill down one's spine. Now, he was one of America's earliest practitioner of the short story and is considered to be the inventor of the detective fiction genre, which he had an inclination to mystery. So, as much as I hate to say it, his death is rather kind of fitting to his life. Um, it was early, it was unexpected, and it is still undetermined. Now, it drew public fascination, but could even Poe have imagined that anything would continue to compel generation after generation of lore lovers, whether or not they've read any of his works? Now, Edgar was the second born child in his family. Woohoo, middle children. Both his mother, Elizabeth Eliza Poe, and his father, David, were actors. But Edgar never really knew his parents. You see, Poe's father actually abandoned the family in 1810 when Edgar was just a year old. Now, Eliza was left to care for her three young children on her own, and she definitely tried her hardest to make ends meet by traveling and acting. But tragedy struck just the next year when she passed away from tuberculosis. And Edgar was actually just 3 years old when he watched his mother die. Now, Edgar was separated from his brother and younger sister when he was taken by a wealthy couple. Tobacco merchant John Allen and his wife Frances Valentine Allen. Um, Now, while they never really officially adopted Edgar, they did change his name to Edgar Allan Poe. And he was with them for a good while, at least until his early adult life. Now, Edgar attended the University of Virginia, but had to drop out only a year later due to the lack of funds for school. And John refused to send him any money, so he turned to gambling to help pay for tuition. But this actually didn't go well, and he racked up quite a bit in gambling debts. Now, he and John often butt heads, as John was more of the business minded, type, and he attempted to kind of push Edgar in that direction and take that route as well. Except from an early age, Edgar dreamt of being a writer and a poet. Now, before he left for the University of Virginia at age 17, he actually became engaged to Sarah Elmira Royster. And although he wrote her many letters during his time at the University of Virginia, Sarah's father disapproved of the engagement, and he actually destroyed every letter before Sarah could see them. It's rude. Edgar began developing signs of depression with manic episodes, and he dropped out of the University of Virginia, returning home to find Sarah engaged to another man. Now, heartbroken, angry, and still having a lot of arguments with John, he joined the army in 1827 under a fake name, and he actually lied about his age as well. So this was actually when he published his first collection called Tamerlane and Other Poems, crediting them to a Bostonian. In just 2 years, he actually reached the rank of sergeant major for artillery. Yet, as we learned, good fortune didn't last long in the life of Edgar Allan Poe. February 28, 1829, Poe's foster mother, Frances, died. Now, although he was given an appointment to the military academy in New York, Edgar decided to move to Baltimore and temporarily live with his Aunt Maria Clem, her daughter Virginia, and he was reunited with his brother Henry. Now, he also published his second book, Al Araf, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems. Now, Edgar ended up traveling to West Point and matriculated as a cadet on July 1st, 1830. Now, in October of that same year, John married his second wife, Louisa Patterson. Now, the marriage with Louisa, along with arguments with Edgar over John's illegitimate children, John actually ended up disowning Edgar. Now, he purposely got court-martialed so he could leave West Point, and he left for New York in February of 1831 and released his third book of poems titled Poems. Now, in March, he returned to his family in Baltimore, and his brother Henry ended up passing away in August after suffering from health problems due to alcoholism. Now, the death of his brother kind of triggered Edgar to be more serious in pursuing his dreams of being a writer. And he began to sell stories to magazines, and he worked hard on his writing. And it was during a pretty difficult time, though. He was one of the first to actually make a living on just writing alone. But with the lack of an international copyright law, a lot of American publishers would print unauthorized copies of British works rather than paying Americans for theirs. Publishers often refused to pay the writers, or they would pay them less than what they promised, and sometimes they would pay them much later than when they promised. Now, this actually had Edgar resorting to repeatedly humiliate himself and beg for money and other assistance. Now, after poetry, Edgar turned to prose, placing a few stories in a Philadelphia publication, which actually won him an award in October of 1833 for his short, M.S. Found in a Bottle. Now, he eventually acquired the title of editor for the Southern Literary Messenger in 1835, though he lost the position a few weeks later for being drunk on the job. Once again, he returned to Baltimore, and on September 22nd, 1835, he obtained the license to marry his cousin, Virginia Clem. Now, Edgar was 27 at this time, and Virginia was 13. Yeah. Now, I know it was common in those times to marry, at crazy age differences, marry your cousin and things like that, but eh. So Poe was actually reinstated to the messenger after he promised good behavior, and he stayed until January 1837. And during this time, it was said that the circulation increased from 700 to 3,500 readers. And he published several poems, book reviews, critiques, and stories in the paper. So things were looking pretty good for him. Now, in May of 1836, Edgar and Virginia held a wedding ceremony at their house with a witness who said that she was 21. Now, over the next decade, Edgar would lead a pretty prosperous life. He would go on to edit various publications. He published his own The Telltale Heart, The Fall of the House of Usher, and Murder in the Rue Morgue. But once again, as expected, in 1842, another tragedy came along. One evening, while singing and playing the piano, Virginia showed the first signs of tuberculosis. Now, Poe described it as breaking a blood vessel in her throat, which sounds horribly painful to me. And she only partially recovered. And this actually caused Edgar to drink more heavily under the stress of her illness. And I'm sure that it also kind of hit a little harder too, because that's what his mother passed away of. And he basically watched her die of the illness. Now, he left his position at Graham's magazine looking for a new job, possibly in government. And he returned to New York, where he took a position at the Evening Mirror before he became editor of the Broadway Journal. And he actually ended up becoming the owner a little bit later. On January 29, 1845, The Raven was published in the Evening Mirror, and it became an immediate sensation. And I'm sure if you've read The Raven, you understand why. This publication actually made Poe a household name and gained him some national fame. Definitely deserved national fame. But despite this, Poe still struggled financially. And I'm sure a lot of it had to do with having to take care of Virginia, constantly drinking, the depressive and manic episodes. Now, on January 30th, 1847, Virginia succumbed to the tuberculosis illness after 5 years. Now, Edgar became increasingly unstable and fell into a tailspin of self-destruction. His depression and alcoholism worsened, causing him to act erratically at times. Now, in 1848, he would attempt suicide, writing a letter that said, "I went to bed and wept for a long, long, hideous night of despair." In 1849, though, Edgar actually reunited with his first fiancée and now widowed Sarah Elmira Royster, and the couple resumed a relationship and became engaged. Only just a few months later, Edgar Allan Poe would be dead. Now, during the summer of 1849, Edgar Allan Poe seemed to be overcoming his demons. Things were looking up. Some say he actually experienced only 2 depressive episodes, and he was drinking less. And he actually completely stopped drinking and joined the temperance movement and started to get healthy and get his life kind of back on track. Now, he was preparing to head to Philadelphia to edit a collection of poems for Marguerite St. Leon Loud. And she was actually a pretty big writer around Edgar Allan Poe's day. And so this was actually a pretty big thing for him. Unfortunately, he never made it, and nor did he make it back to escort his aunt to Virginia for his upcoming wedding. Now, no one knows why, but Poe made a stop in Baltimore before heading to Philadelphia. And for the next 5 days, no one has any clue where he was or what he was doing. And that brings us to October 3rd, 1849. Poe was found outside Gunner's Hall in great distress and in need of immediate attention. As I said earlier, Joseph Walker sent a letter to Dr. Joseph Snodgrass stating, "Dear Sir, there is a gentleman rather worse for wear at Ryan's Fourth Pole Ward's polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress, and says he is acquainted with you. He is in need of immediate assistance. Yours in haste, Jos W. Walker." Now, within a few hours, Snodgrass arrived along with one of Poe's uncles, and neither they nor any other family member could explain his behavior, his absence, or his appearance. And they actually they took Poe, to the Washington College Hospital, where he fell into a blind fever. Now, for 4 days, Dr. John Moran oversaw him, and Poe was racked with fever dreams and vivid hallucinations, and he called out repeatedly for someone named Reynolds, but there's no one of his family or friends who knew anyone by that name, and historians have actually been able to unable to identify anyone with that name in his life at all. Now, he also made a reference to a wife in Richmond, except Virginia, as we know, died a year prior, and he hadn't married Sarah yet. Now, at 5 a.m. on October 7th, 1849, at just 40 years old, Edgar Allan Poe died. Alone and secluded from the world in a hospital prison-like room with barred windows. Dr. Morin was sitting with him as he said his final words, "Lord, help my poor soul," and he took his last breath. Now, there's no medical records, there's no death certificate. His death is a complete mystery. But what does that open us up to? Theories. Now, the newspaper recorded Poe's cause of death as cerebral inflammation. And I actually find this to be a really sad point that I found in my research. His fiancée, Sarah, learned of his death through the newspapers. I guess nobody had time to really send word to her when he died. And I just think it's really sad. It's almost like if you were to find out that your loved one had passed away through Facebook or Instagram or something like that these days. Like you're not even being told face to face or by somebody who can kind of console you or give you details. She found out through the newspapers. Cerebral inflammation at the time was the term used for alcoholism. However, we know that Poe had joined the temperance movement before and actually hadn't drank for quite a while. And he also had hyperglycemia, which would cause alcohol to mess with him even more, and it was actually really dangerous for him to drink. So he was trying to get healthy again and definitely tried to avoid alcohol. And it's also stated that Dr. Morin said Poe didn't have any odor of alcohol on him. No liquor, no beer, no wine, no anything like that. And I feel like you'd smell it. If he was that drunk to the point that he's lying in a gutter and he's, on the brink of death and has now died, I think that you would have been able to smell alcohol on him if that was the cause. Now, a lot of people had denounced these claims, but there was a biography written by a man named Griswold, and he was one of Poe's enemies. And a lot of people accepted this, and it gave this biography, and it gave people a negative view of Edgar Allan Poe. And I haven't read it. I probably won't. Maybe I will, just to see what he said about him. However, as a lover of Poe, I definitely don't want to, when you read something about somebody you like and then you're like, that's not correct, and you want to throw the book. Yeah. Now, another theory is that Poe was a victim of something called cooping. And in the mid 1800s, unscrupulous politicians, didn't know that scrupulous politicians existed, but whatever. So, unscrupulous politicians were known to employ local goons who would go around kidnapping random men off the street. They would then force drugs or alcohol in them, force them to vote in the polls over and over again. And they would change their clothes, they would alter their appearance in some way in order to ensure that they would be given a new vote each time. And they actually did this like for hours and hours and hours on election day. So I could see how somebody would be, if they had alcohol or drugs forced into them, it could have been possible. Poe was found outside of an election of a polling location on election day in clothes that weren't his. So it definitely could explain what happened to him. Also, if he had stopped drinking and he didn't do any drugs during his life. So I'm sure he could definitely have a very, very horrible reaction to that if that's what happened. Now, another theory is rabies, and mostly because his symptoms that he had actually matched the symptoms of rabies. The madness that he went through had ebbs and flows, with small periods of lucidness in between spikes of mania. Now, Dr. Morin noted that Poe drank very little water, which also matches symptoms of rabies. Lethargy, confusion, rapid downward spiral towards delirium, hallucinations, and rapid shallow breathing. And from what I've seen, 4 days is the average length of survival after the onset of serious symptoms actually show in rabies, people who get rabies. Now, this could be a possibility. However, with no DNA evidence, it's impossible to say. Also, no animal bites were ever mentioned anywhere in Dr. Morin's writings. Now, I know that there aren't medical records from the hospital. However, Morin actually did do writings a little bit later on after Poe had passed away. Now, they also say it could have been the flu that had advanced into pneumonia, which is what killed him. So many possibilities. Now, in 1999, public health researchers argued that Poe's death was from a result of carbon monoxide poisoning. And they took clippings of his hair and tested them for heavy metals, but those tests were inconclusive. But they did other tests that revealed high levels of mercury in Poe's system. And he lived through a cholera epidemic, and Poe's doctor prescribed calomel or mercury chloride, which could explain some of his hallucinations and delirium. Now, the only thing is he did have high levels of mercury, but I believe that some of the research I did said that they probably weren't high enough to actually kill him. So it's once again where it's like it could be this. However, there's probable cause that it most likely wasn't. Now, there's a theory that's a little more modern that states Poe succumbed to a brain tumor which caused his symptoms and behavior. And of course, if you have a tumor, or brain cancer, and it causes your brain to swell. All of these symptoms could be exhibited. And if you remember the episode from a couple of weeks ago that I did on the Old Western burial ground, you know that when Edgar first passed away, he was buried in an unmarked grave. But then he was exhumed 26 years later when they were moving him to the bigger location. So as people were coming in, they could stop and see his monument. Now, while they were moving his coffin, it completely fell apart. And so while the workers were trying to move it, they were, trying to move his body as well. And they said that very little of Poe's body remained, but workers remarked on a strange feature of Poe's skull. There was a mass rolling around inside of it. Now, newspapers of the day claimed that the cerebral mass was Poe's brain, which just had diminished, but yet somehow stayed intact. But after 26 years, especially being buried and in those elements, there's just no way that your brain still exists. It would completely deteriorate. But what could linger would be a hard, shrunken brain tumor. And actually, a forensic pathologist said a tumor can calcify and after death and turn into a hard mass. So, once again, it could have been just a brain tumor that caused his death. Now, there's another series of theories that state that Edgar was beaten to death. And there's a couple of different stories that went around. So this is probably one of those that aren't really, well, it really isn't one that could be, sure, it could have happened. However, with so many different stories of how it happened, I'm not sure if I believe them. But one of them is that at the instigation of a woman who considered herself injured by his writing, she hired people who were to cruelly beat him senseless to the point where his brain fever followed and he died. Now, another story that was being passed around was while in Baltimore, Poe ran into some friends from West Point who convinced him to have a drink. Now, it was said that he got drunk off of one glass of champagne. He left his friends and wandered the streets in a daze. And while in that drunken state, he was robbed and beaten by ruffians and left delirious in the gutter until he was found the next day. Now, while it could have happened, I just don't find it to be plausible. Now, yet another story about Poe being beaten was that he was actually murdered by the brothers of his wealthy fiancée. Now, it claims that Poe did make it to Philadelphia, where he was ambushed by her three brothers, and they warned Edgar not to marry their sister, and frightened by the threat, Poe actually disguised himself in the shabby clothing and hid for a week before heading back to Richmond to get married. Now, it's said that her brothers then followed Poe to Baltimore, beat him, and forced him to drink whiskey, which they knew would send him into his final spiral towards death. And once again, it's just not plausible. I feel like when Sarah and Edgar kind of reunited, it was a happy reunion. Now, I know her father didn't approve of it before, but I don't think her father was still around at this time. And sure, the brothers may not have been happy about it. However, I don't think they would have followed him all the way to Philadelphia, and then all the way to Baltimore, and then all the way. I think that's just a lot of, just a lot. And while all of those theories are like darkly entertaining, they're not, like I said, they're just not very plausible. No one has any definite answers, and there's no death certificate. There's no medical records to go back through. We just have a bunch of theories, and all of them can have enough doubt to go, I don't think it's that one. Now, I feel the most believable story is the cooping theory, except there was no odor of alcohol on Edgar. So if they force fed him tons of alcohol, I feel like no matter how much you feed somebody to control them, I still feel like they would have been able to sense that he was drunk in some way. But I also think that maybe there were a couple of different factors that contributed, oh my heavens, um, to Poe's death. But now, today, Edgar Allan Poe is regarded as one of the best authors of history. His works of mystery and gothic horror have been made into many stage plays and numerous Hollywood movies over the years. And there's actually even a fictional account of his death in the 2012 film The Raven, starring John Cusack as Edgar Allan Poe, which John Cusack actually popped up in my last episode because it was the shooting of Danny Hansford, and they made a movie based on a book about that called Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. So I wonder if that says something. I mean, besides the fact that actually I love John Cusack, he's one of my favorite actors. And so maybe he's just, I don't know, why are you popping up, John? So tell me your thoughts, though. Comment below, share, tag your friends. Maybe they have a theory. Maybe they have something to say about Poe's death. If they don't know about Poe's death and you want to share this crazy story, please share. But yeah, go ahead and comment. Tell me, join in on the conversation, get a conversation going. Tell me what you feel. Tell me if you have any theories that I actually didn't find in my research, because I'm sure there's plenty of them out there. Once again, I just ask that you keep all of the comments respectful, please. This is a place of love and creepy and spooky, but not mean or, belittling. No bullying. But, and I know you know what I'm going to say next. Until next crime. Creepy Cases and Spooky Spaces with Cassie Opea is a Pizza and Pigtails production. All episodes are researched, written, and edited by yours truly. You can find new episodes every Friday, with bonus episodes coming out every other Tuesday. You can find the podcast on your favorite listening platform, or now you can find it on YouTube as well. Don't forget to follow along on social media, creepycases.spookyspaces, for all future news, updates, and maybe some content that you won't find on the podcast. Also, be sure to subscribe so you can get access to bonus content, early access to content, and a couple of little thank you swag. If you'd like to contact me about appearing on a future episode, maybe you would like to suggest your own creepy case or spooky space, or maybe you'd also like to reach out about ad space, you can reach me directly at creepycases.spookyspaces@gmail.com, or feel free to reach out through those social media platforms as well. And, as always, see you next crime.